At 22 minutes past 10 on the morning of February 14th, 1943, a flight of Marine Corsairs was climbing through broken cloud over the Solomon Sea, escorting a formation of heavy bombers toward the Japanese airfield at Kahili, on the southern tip of Bougainville. The men in the cockpits had, on average, about 25 hours each in the aircraft they were flying. 2 days earlier, they had landed their machines on Guadalcanal for the first time. They had never been in a fight in them. The bombers ahead of them were going to be the bait, and the men flying the new gull-winged fighters were going to be the protection, and somewhere above and ahead of them, in numbers nobody in the formation could yet see, the Zeros were waiting. By the time the day was over, the squadron had lost 2 of its pilots, the bombers had lost 2 of their number, and the assorted Army fighters along on the mission had lost 4 P-38s and 2 P-40s. The Marines had claimed 3 Zeros, one of them brought down by a head-on collision that destroyed the Corsair as well. The men of the squadron would refer to that first mission, ever afterward, as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was the combat debut of the aircraft that post-war American advertising would teach 2 generations to call whistling death, the fighter that the records would eventually credit with shooting down 11 enemy aircraft for every one of its own lost in air-to-air combat. On the day it first met the enemy, it lost. That gap between the way the Corsair began and the way it is remembered is the subject of this account. The title above promises a story about Japanese aces who mocked the airplane until it slaughtered them at a ratio of 11-1. The truth underneath that title is more interesting than the title, and in some places it runs directly against it because the 11-1 figure and the nickname Whistling Death are themselves partly inventions, and the men who flew against the Corsair did not begin by mocking it. They began by killing it. What changed between February of 1943 and the end of the war was not the airplane's reputation, but the war around it. And to understand how a fighter that lost its first battle became a symbol of American air dominance, you have to set aside the legend and look at the machine, the men who flew it, the enemy they flew against, and the 2 years of accumulating advantage that the legend papers over. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. Start with the machine, because the machine is where the contradiction begins. In 1938, the United States Navy issued a requirement for a single-engine carrier fighter that could fly faster and farther than anything then in service. The Vought Company's chief engineer, Rex Beisel, answered it by building the smallest possible airframe around the largest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. To turn that much power into thrust, the design needed an enormous propeller, 13 feet and 4 inches across. A propeller that size needs ground clearance, and ground clearance ordinarily means tall, heavy landing gear, which is exactly what a carrier aircraft cannot afford. Beisel's solution was the feature that made the Corsair instantly recognizable for the rest of the century. He bent the wing downward where it met the fuselage and back up at the landing gear, an inverted gull shape that lifted the engine and propeller high off the deck, while keeping the landing struts short and stout. The bend also let the wing meet the fuselage at close to a right angle, which reduced drag without the fairings other designs needed. The prototype flew for the first time on the 29th of May, 1940. That October, in a test flight, it became the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight. On paper, it was the most powerful carrier fighter in the world before the Battle of Britain had ended. And then the Navy tried to make it work, and the trouble started. When the requirement was revised to carry heavier armament, 6 half-inch machine guns mounted in the wings, the fuel they displaced had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was a tank in the fuselage that pushed the cockpit nearly 3 feet aft. The pilot now sat far back behind a very long nose, and during the slow, nose-high approach to a carrier deck, he could not see the deck at all. The airplane had other vices waiting for him there. At low speed, one wing would stall before the other, the torque of that huge engine and propeller rolling the aircraft unexpectedly. The landing gear struts, when they hit the deck, tended to bottom out and then rebound, bouncing the fighter back into the air like a pogo stick over the arresting wires toward whatever was parked ahead. In the autumn of 1942, a Navy test pilot named Sam Porter took a Corsair out to the escort carrier Sangamon in Chesapeake Bay to see whether the thing could be flown off a ship at all. After 4 landings, he stopped. He was, by his own account, convinced the airplane was going to kill him. He could barely see the landing signal officer past the nose. The long cowling robbed him of the cues he needed to correct his approach, and every touchdown threatened to throw him back into the air. The verdict was that the Corsair, the fastest carrier fighter anyone had built, was not safe to operate from carriers. Pilots in training were dying trying to learn it. At one training base in the California desert, there were well over 100 Corsair accidents. The men gave the airplane a name, and it was not Whistling Death. They called it the Ensign Eliminator and the Bent Wing Widowmaker, and they meant it because the airplane was killing American pilots before it had killed a single Japanese one. So the Navy did something that, in retrospect, looks like an admission of failure and turned out to be the making of the airplane. It declined to take the Corsair to sea, kept its decks for the more forgiving Grumman Hellcat, and handed the gull-winged fighter to the Marine Corps, who would fly it from dirt and crush coral strips ashore. The Marines, equipped until then with the slow and outclassed Wildcat, took it gladly. That is how a carrier fighter that could not land on carriers came to make its name as a land-based airplane in the Solomon Islands, and how the men of one Marine squadron came to be climbing toward Bougainville on St. Valentine's Day with 24 hours in type and no idea what they were about to meet. What they were about to meet had ruled the sky over the Pacific for a year and a half. And to understand a collision, you have to take the Japanese fighter as seriously as the men of 1943 were forced to take it. The Mitsubishi A6M, which the Allies codenamed Zeke and almost everyone called the Zero, was the product of a design philosophy as ruthless and coherent as the Corsairs was brute force. Its designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had been handed a specification so demanding that another firm had walked away calling it impossible. A carrier fighter that could turn tighter than anything in the sky, climb faster, and fly farther than any single-engine fighter had a right to. Horikoshi met it by removing weight wherever weight could be removed. He used a light alloy for the structure. He gave the airplane no armor plate behind the pilot. He gave its fuel tanks no self-sealing lining. Every pound he saved went into range and agility, and the result, when it appeared over China in 1940 and swept across the Pacific in the first months of the war, was a fighter that Allied pilots learned to fear the way the Germans on the Western Front would learn to fear American artillery. In the battle for Java alone, in the early months of 1942, Zeros destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft. The airplane built its own legend and its own kill ratio, and the figure that gets quoted for the Zero in its first year of dominance is, by an irony worth holding on to, about 12-1 in its favor. That is the belief the men in the Corsairs were colliding with, and it was not a foolish belief. It was a correct description of how air combat had gone for 18 months. If you got into a turning fight with a Zero at moderate speed, you lost, because the Japanese fighter could turn inside you and put its 2 cannon and 2 machine guns into your cockpit before you came around. The Japanese naval aviators of 1942 were among the best trained pilots in the world, with hundreds of hours and, in many cases, combat experience over China. The doctrine they carried was built on the airplane they flew: close, turn, dogfight, and win. It had always worked. There was no reason yet for any of them to think it would stop working against a new American fighter with an ugly bent wing that, by every report reaching them, could not even land on its own carriers. But the Zero's strengths were purchased at a price that did not show until someone made it pay. The same lightness that let it turn so beautifully made it fragile. With no armor and no self-sealing tanks, a Zero that took a solid burst from half-inch guns tended to catch fire or come apart. One American flyer put it that the airplane was easily destroyed once you had it in your sights, and that the entire problem was getting it into your sights. And the controls that were so light and responsive at the speeds where the Zero liked to fight grew heavy and then nearly immovable as speed climbed. Above roughly 216 miles an hour, the aileron stiffened. In a steep dive, the airplane could not follow a heavier fighter down, could not roll quickly to escape, and risked tearing itself apart if pushed past its limits. The Zero owned the slow, turning fight. It did not own the fast, vertical one. Nobody had yet built an American fighter fast enough and tough enough to force the fight into the part of the envelope where the Zero was weak and keep it there. The Corsair was that fighter, but the airplane alone did not know it, and neither on St. Valentine's Day did the men flying it. The lesson had to be paid for. Over the weeks that followed that first bloody escort mission, the pilots of the 1st Corsair squadron worked out, in combat and at the cost of their friends, the rules that would turn the airplane's brute advantages into a method. The core rule was a single sentence, and it is one of the most important sentences in the air war in the Pacific. Never turn with the Zero. Do not try to outmaneuver an airplane that was built to outmaneuver everything. Use what you have that it is not. The Corsair was faster in level flight, far faster in a dive, and could zoom back up to altitude afterward in a way the lighter Japanese fighter could not match. So the method became this: hold the height advantage, dive on the enemy from above, fire in a single high-speed pass, and use the energy of the dive to climb back out of reach before coming around for another. Do not stay and mix it up. Make one pass, break away, set up again. The pilots gave themselves a hard floor on airspeed when they were anywhere near a Zero. Never let it drop below 250 miles an hour, because below that speed you were fighting on the enemy's terms, and on the enemy's terms you died. This was not a Corsair invention. It was the hard-won American answer to the Zero across every type. The dive and zoom attack the books would call boom and zoom, and it was reinforced by a piece of teamwork called the Thatch Weave, in which two fighters flying abreast would turn toward each other whenever an enemy latched onto one, so that the hunted aircraft led the attacker straight across the guns of its partner. The genius of it was that none of it required a better dogfighter than the Zero. It required a fighter that could choose not to dogfight, and that could survive the choice. The Corsair, with its 2,000 horsepower and its heavy structure and its self-sealing tanks and its armor, could choose. The Zero, committed by its own design to the turning fight, could only wait to be dived on. The man who showed what the method could do, once it was understood, was a former enlisted pilot named Kenneth Walsh, who had earned his wings as a private in the years before the war and was flying Corsairs over the Solomons in that first hard spring. On the 1st of April, 1943, 6 weeks after the St. Valentine's Day disaster, Walsh shot down 3 Zeros in a single fight. On the 13th of May, he shot down 3 more, and in doing so became the first ace flying the Corsair. By the middle of August, he had 10 victories. He had not become a better turning fighter than the Japanese. He had become a master of refusing the turning fight, of using height and speed and the dive, of taking the one good pass and living to take another. The airplane that could not land on a carrier was in the right hands and flown the right way, becoming the most dangerous thing in that sky. It is worth slowing down here because this is the hinge of the whole story, and it is the place where the legend and the history pull apart. The Corsair did not win because it was a magic airplane, and the Japanese did not lose because they were fools who underestimated it. The Corsair won the fights it won because its pilots learned to impose a kind of combat the Zero could not survive, and because the airplane had the speed and the strength to impose it. Every part of that advantage was real, and almost none of it was the airplane being better at the thing the Zero was good at. The Zero could still outturn the Corsair on the last day of the war exactly as easily as on the first. What changed was that fewer and fewer Americans were willing to turn with it, and more Japanese pilots were meeting an enemy who simply would not come down and play the game they had trained their whole careers to win. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And there is a second thing changing underneath the dogfights, slower and more decisive than any tactic, which is the thing the 11-to-1 ratio is really measuring and the thing the legend most badly distorts. The Corsair's great air-to-air record was overwhelmingly built in one period in one place. The fighting over the Solomons and the great Japanese base at Rabaul, from the airplane's arrival in early 1943 until the skies over Rabaul were finally cleared at the start of 1944. That is where the leading Corsair aces ran up most of their scores. It is where the St. Valentine's Day Squadron and the ones that followed it ground down the Japanese naval air arm in a battle of attrition that the Japanese, with a smaller industry and a slower pilot training pipeline, could not afford. After that window closed, the war moved north and west, and Corsair squadrons increasingly found themselves with fewer enemy aircraft to fight and more ground to attack. For much of the rest of the war, the airplane that the legend remembers as a dogfighter was carrying bombs and rockets against Japanese positions, dropping, by one accounting, the great majority of the bomb tonnage delivered by American fighters in the Pacific. The 11-to-1 ratio, 2,140 claimed victories against 189 losses in air combat, is a true number, but it is a number with a shape, and the shape is that most of those victories came in a relatively short, intense period against an enemy whose best pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced, because that is the deeper collision underneath the one in the title. The Japanese naval aviators of 1942 were superb, and many of them died in 1943 over places like Rabaul, and the men who replaced them had less training, fewer hours, and far less experience, because Japan had built a force of irreplaceable experts rather than a system for replacing them. The Corsairs pilots, by contrast, kept coming, kept learning, kept passing on what they had learned to the next squadron, and were flying an airplane that American industry was turning out by the thousand. By the time the war reached its later battles, the typical Japanese pilot of Corsair met was not a master who had honed his craft over China. He was a young man with a fraction of the training, in an airplane whose advantages had not changed, but whose pilot could no longer fully use them, against an enemy who knew exactly how to kill him and had the speed and the height and the numbers to do it. The ratio did not climb only because the Corsair got better. It climbed because the other side got worse, and a legend that the airplane simply overawed the Japanese leaves that whole tragedy out. The deepest part of the legend, though, is the part that almost everyone repeats and almost nobody examines, and it is worth pulling apart with some care because this channel is built for an audience that would rather have the truth than the slogan. The name, Whistling Death. It is a magnificent piece of language. It is on the museum placards, and in the documentaries, and in the title cards of 100 retellings, always with the same explanation, that the air rushing through the oil cooler intakes and the leading edges of that bent wing made a distinctive shriek in a dive, and that the Japanese, hearing it overhead, gave the airplane the name out of fear and respect. The trouble is that the name does not appear in the Japanese records. It is not in Japanese wartime accounts, not in the war diaries, not in the interrogations of captured Japanese airmen. When historians who actually work in the Japanese sources go looking for the original of the phrase, they do not find it, because there is no original. The most careful work on the Corsair against the Zero concludes that Whistling Death was not bestowed by hairy Japanese pilots at all. It was written by the publicity department of the company that built the airplane attached to it during the war, and repeated so many times since that it acquired the weight of fact. The same scholarship that traces the nickname to a Vought press office also notes, in the same breath, that the famous score ratio is wrapped in the same kind of manufactured mystique, a true statistic doing the work of a tall tale. This matters, and it matters in a way that is not merely about correcting a caption. The story we are usually told is that the enemy named the Corsair, that the men who flew against it were so impressed and so frightened that they reached for poetry. It is a flattering story, and the direction of the flattery is the giveaway. An airplane whose own maker has to invent the enemies offer it is an airplane whose real record needed help. And the Corsair's real record did not need help. It was a genuinely superior fighter, flown increasingly well, in a war its own country was winning on every other axis at the same time, and the plain version of that is more than impressive enough without a slogan stenciled on by an advertising man in Connecticut. The legend reaches for the enemy's voice because the enemy's voice carries a credibility that a sales brochure does not. The history does not need it. So when the title above says that Japanese aces mocked the Corsair until it killed 11 of them for every loss, the honest answer is that this is two different errors folded into one sentence, and that taking them apart is the actual story. The Japanese aces of 1942 did not mock the Corsair because in 1942 it did not exist in their sky. When it arrived in early 1943, they did not mock it either. They shot 2 of its pilots down on its first mission and went on inflicting losses on it for months while the Americans learned. And the 11-to-1 figure was not the verdict of humbled aces. It was the arithmetic of a long attrition, concentrated in one campaign, against an air arm that was bleeding out its irreplaceable veterans, and it was then dressed in borrowed Japanese, all by the people with an interest in selling airplanes. The real story is that the Corsair started as a death trap for its own pilots, was rejected by the service it was built for, was handed to the Marines almost as a consolation, and there, flown by men who buried their friends learning how, became one of the deadliest fighters of the war by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms at the exact moment the enemy was losing the ability to enforce those terms. That is a better story than the title. It is also, unlike the title, true. There's a tendency, in telling it this way, to swing too far the other direction, to debunk the airplane into mediocrity, and that would be its own kind of falsehood. The Corsair was not overrated in the way that matters. Its loss rate in air combat was genuinely the lowest of any American fighter in the Pacific, and that is not a number a press office can manufacture. It is in the squadron records, in the lists of aircraft that came home, and the lists of the ones that did not. The airplane really was faster than the Zero, really could outdive it and outroll it at speed, really did give its pilot armor behind his back and fuel tanks that would not light off at the first incendiary round, really could absorb damage that would have torn a Zero apart and bring its man home. Those advantages were the difference between Kenneth Walsh's 3 zeros in a fight and a smoking hole in the jungle. The dive and zoom method only worked because there was an airplane that could survive the dive, take the punishment of a missed pass, and climb away with energy to spare. The machine was not a myth. The myth was only ever the part where the enemy supposedly told you so. What the airplane became after the Solomons is the part of the story that the legend, fixed forever on the dogfight, tends to forget, and it is the part where the Corsair earned a different and more durable kind of importance. As the air-to-air targets thinned out, the airplane that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 rockets under that long-spanning wing turned into one of the best ground attack aircraft of the war. Marine Corsairs flew close support for the men crawling up the islands toward Japan, and the sound of that bent-wing fighter coming in low was, for the infantry it supported, the sound of help arriving. One of the men who flew Corsair bombing missions in the Pacific in 1944 was Charles Lindbergh, the civilian who had crossed the Atlantic alone 17 years before, now flying combat sorties as a technical advisor and quietly teaching squadrons how to wring more range and more bomb load out of the airplane than the book said was possible. The Corsair that the Navy would not put to sea ended the war as a fighter-bomber with few equals, and that capability, not the dogfight record, is what carried it into the next war. Because the Corsair did something almost no other piston fighter of its generation managed. It outlived its own era. The carrier landing problems that had condemned it to the beach were eventually solved, and by an unlikely solver. It was the British Fleet Air Arm, flying Corsair supplied under Lend-Lease, who worked out the technique that tamed the airplane at sea, a curving approach to the deck that let the pilot keep the landing signal officer in sight around that enormous nose until the last possible moment, combined with modifications to the bouncing landing gear. The Americans watched the British operate Corsairs from carriers throughout 1944, reversed the judgment they had made in the Chesapeake, and brought the airplane aboard their own ships in the last year of the war, where its speed made it valuable against the kamikazes in a way the slower fighters were not. The fighter that failed its carrier trials in 1942 finished the war as a carrier fighter after all, by way of a foreign navy that refused to take the failure as final. And then it kept going. The Corsair stayed in production for 11 years, the longest run of any American piston engine fighter. The lines at Vought and Goodyear turning out more than 12,000 of them between 1942 and 1953. It went to war again in Korea, where the jets had taken over the air-to-air role and the Corsair returned to the work it had grown into, flying more close support sorties than almost anything else in the theater, and where a Marine pilot named Jesse Falmer managed the improbable feat of shooting down a MiG-15 jet with a propeller-driven fighter that had first flown a decade before the jet was designed. Corsairs flew on into the 1960s in the hands of other nations. French Navy Corsairs flew in Indochina and over Suez. The very last shots fired in anger by Corsairs may have been in a brief war between Honduras and El Salvador at the end of the 1960s. Fighter aircraft from the first months of the Second World War, still flying combat a quarter-century after the war that made them ended. It is a strange afterlife for an airplane that began by killing the men sent to learn it, and the strangeness is the point. The Corsair's whole career is a study in how the first verdict on a thing is so often wrong, and in how the qualities that look like fatal flaws in one context turn out to be the makings of greatness in another. The long nose that blinded a pilot on a carrier approach was the housing for the most powerful engine and propeller combination flown on any fighter in the war. The bent wing that became the airplane's signature was an engineer's grudging compromise to fit a propeller too big for conventional landing gear. The relegation to the Marines that looked like a demotion put the airplane in the hands of the service and the campaign that suited it best at the moment its strengths mattered most. None of that was foresight. It was a series of accidents and necessities that happened to line up the same way the American artillery system that terrified the German infantry had begun as an accident of peacetime poverty. The same way the cheapest war-winning idea is so often the one nobody planned. The men who flew the Corsair in its first hard months did not get to know any of this. The two pilots lost on the St. Valentine's Day mission did not live to see the airplane that killed them become a legend, or to see that legend questioned, or to see the bent-wing fighter flying off carriers and into another war and another decade. They flew an airplane the Navy had given up on, with 24 hours in type, against the best fighter pilots in the Pacific, and they died at the very beginning of a learning curve that other men would climb on the strength of what was learned from their deaths. Kenneth Walsh climbed it. The squadrons that came after climbed it. The method that turned the Corsair into a killer was written, line by line, in the after-action reports of men who had watched friends spin into the sea trying to turn with a zero, and who passed on the one sentence that mattered: never turn with the zero to whoever came next. That sentence saved more American pilots than any nickname ever frightened a Japanese one. This is the part the legend cannot hold, because the legend is about an airplane and the truth is about a process. The Corsair did not arrive as whistling death. It arrived as the ensign eliminator, and it became something else through 2 years of dying and learning and industrial weight and an enemy hollowing out from within, and the 11-to-1 ratio is the scar tissue of that process, not a trophy handed over by beaten aces. The Japanese pilots who met the Corsair at the end were not the men who had ruled the sky at the beginning. And the difference between those two groups of men is a more honest explanation for the ratio than any story about fear and respect. War is rarely won by the better machine. It is won by the side that can replace its experts, learn from its dead, build its airplanes by the thousand, and keep coming after the other side has run out of the men who knew how to win. The Corsair was a superb fighter. It was also, like the artillery system and the field telephone and every other quiet war winner, the visible tip of an entire country's capacity to absorb a hard first lesson and turn it into a method. So the answer to the question in the title is that it was never quite the question. The Japanese did not mock the Corsair and then get slaughtered for it. The Corsair was mocked, if anything, by its own side first, by the American pilots who named it for the ensigns it killed. It earned its reputation slowly, in the only place it was allowed to fight, against an enemy whose decline it accelerated but did not by itself cause. And the most famous thing about it, the name the enemy supposedly gave it in terror, was written by the people who needed to sell it. Strip all of that away, and what remains is better than the myth. A flawed, brilliant, dangerous airplane, flown by men who paid in their own lives to learn how, that became one of the deadliest fighters of its war, and then refused to die for another 20 years. The whistle was real. The death was real. The part where the enemy named it was the advertisement. The history was always the better story. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.